Our entire history could have vanished without a trace. Every story, every law, every great idea simply lost to the passing of time. Tonight, we uncover the brilliant, ancient inventions that stopped that from happening. You will learn the true story of how humans learned to trap their thoughts in physical form, a tale of clay, reeds, and sheer ingenuity that built the world we know. We will see how a simple need to count sheep sparked the first written symbols, and how a secret recipe from a Chinese court official created the surface that carries our knowledge. What did the very first words look like, and why was the formula for paper guarded like a treasure? Before we drift into the past, what is one thought you would most want to preserve for 1,000 years? The answer to that question was found in the fertile mud between two great rivers. Imagine a world where every transaction, every promise, every boundary line existed only in the fading echo of a spoken word. As the first great cities of Sumer rose from the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, their people faced a problem we can scarcely comprehend. A farmer delivers 500 bushels of barley to the temple granary. A merchant agrees to pay 10 measures of silver in 3 months' time. A king declares a new law for all the land. In a village, such things could be remembered. But in a bustling city of thousands, where deals were made with strangers and goods flowed in from distant places, human memory was a fragile, unreliable vessel. The sheer scale of it all created a mystery, a silent pressure building in the minds of the temple priests and city administrators. How could you prove what was owed, what was owned, or what was true once the people who made the agreement were gone? The stories of gods and heroes could be passed down in songs and chants, but the weight of an empire, it turned out, could not rest on whispers. They needed something that could hold a fact as solidly as a brick holds up a wall. They needed to make memory itself visible and permanent, and so, with nothing more than damp clay and a sharp reed, they began to solve the greatest puzzle of their age, the puzzle of how to stop time from stealing their world. Their solution began not with words but with shapes. Long before anyone dreamed of an alphabet, the people of ancient Mesopotamia, nearly 10,000 years ago, were grappling with that same pressure to remember. In a world without writing, how does a merchant keep track of a flock of sheep scattered across distant hills? How does a temple account for the jars of oil in its storerooms? Their answer was beautifully, profoundly simple. They began to fashion tiny clay objects, each one a physical promise. A small cone might stand for a single measure of grain. A sphere could represent a jar of precious oil. A tetrahedron, a shape with 4 triangular faces, might mean a full day's labor. These were the first tokens, the silent, 3-dimensional vocabulary of commerce. A farmer delivering 10 sheep to the city would hand over 10 small clay sheep tokens. The official would then seal them inside a hollow clay ball, a bulla, and press his personal seal into the soft surface. This clay envelope was a locked contract. The tokens inside were the private record, and the seal on the outside was the signature, a guarantee that no one could tamper with the count without breaking the clay. It was a system of memory you could hold in your hand, a brilliant stopgap against forgetting. But then someone had a flash of insight that would change everything. What if you did not need to break the clay to remember what was inside? What if the record could exist on the surface for all to see? A clever accountant, perhaps frustrated by having to smash open bully to verify counts, made a revolutionary move. Before sealing the tokens away, he began to press each one firmly into the surface of the soft clay envelope. A cone token left a conical mark, a sphere left a circular impression. Now the outside of the bulla bore a perfect 2-dimensional catalogue of the treasures hidden within. You could read the contract without breaking the seal. In that simple act of pressing a 3-dimensional object into a flat plane, humanity crossed an invisible threshold. They had stopped simply storing information. They had begun to represent it. The symbol was now separate from the thing it symbolized. That circular impression was no longer a clay sphere. It was the idea of a jar of oil. It was a sign, and on the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, the first whisper of writing had been heard. The pressing of a token left a simple, readable mark. But what if the mark itself could carry a more complex story? In the great city-states of Sumer, around 3,400 years before the Common Era, those impressions evolved into the world's first true writing. Scribes took a sharpened reed, a humble tool cut from the riverside, and pressed its angled tip into tablets of damp clay. Each press did not drag to draw a line, it was tapped in, leaving a distinctive wedge-shaped depression. The Latin word for wedge is cuneious, and so we call this system cuneiform, writing with wedges. At first, these wedges were arranged to form pictographs, straightforward pictures of the world. A simple drawing of a head meant head, a sketch of a bowl meant food or ration, but pictographs have limits. How do you draw an idea like life or belief or tomorrow? The Sumerian scribes, in a stroke of genius, began to let the pictures represent sounds. The pictograph for water, which was pronounced a in Sumerian, could now be used as the sound a in other words. A sign for an arrow, pronounced tai, could be used for the sound tai. This was the monumental leap from writing that could only show things to writing that could capture language itself, syllable by spoken syllable. With this power, cuneiform became the voice of an empire. It recorded the heroic adventures of King Gilgamesh on towering tablets of poetry. It etched the solemn laws of kings into permanent stone steels for all to see. And in its most humble, beautiful form, it documented a merchant's receipt for 5 goats or a worker's daily ration of beer. The same wedge-shaped marks that held epic myths also balanced the accounts of daily life, proving that from its very beginning, writing was not just for the gods or the kings. It was the scaffold that held civilization together, one pressed wedge at a time. Across the desert, another script was being carved not into clay but into eternity. While cuneiform wedges recorded the practical affairs of Mesopotamia along the life-giving Nile, the ancient Egyptians developed a writing system of breathtaking artistry and sacred purpose. Emerging around the same time, roughly 3,200 years before the Common Era, hieroglyphs were far more than mere notation. The word itself comes from Greek, meaning sacred carvings, and that is precisely what they were. These elegant pictures of birds, snakes, eyes, and household objects were not doodles in the margins. They were the formal script of the gods and pharaohs, designed to endure forever on stone. To read them is to understand a culture that saw writing as a magical act, a way to make words permanent in the very substance of the world. But do not be fooled by their beautiful simplicity, for the hieroglyphic system was a complex and sophisticated code. It employed 3 clever types of signs working in harmony. First were the logograms, where a picture directly represented a word. The image of the sun disk meant the sun, the drawing of a foot meant to walk. Then came the phonograms, signs that represented sounds, much like the sound signs in cuneiform. A picture of an owl might stand for the sound M, while a basket represented the sound K. This allowed scribes to spell out names and abstract ideas, but the real genius was in the third type, the determinative. This was a silent sign placed at the end of a word. It did not add a sound, it clarified the word's meaning category. After spelling out a word for a type of wood, a scribe might add the determinative sign for tree. After writing the name of a town, they would add the sign for a city with crossroads. Think of it like an emoji placed after a word to prevent confusion, a visual guidepost in a landscape of pictures. This elegant system was reserved for the most important messages imaginable. Hieroglyphs adorned the towering walls of Karnak Temple, telling of Pharaoh's victories granted by the gods. They covered every surface inside the tomb of a king, providing the spells and maps he would need for his journey through the afterlife. To write something in hieroglyphs was to make it true for all time, to etch a divine truth into the fabric of the universe. And then, quite suddenly, the knowledge of how to read this sacred code vanished. For over 1,000 years after the fall of pharaonic Egypt, the silent, beautiful carvings on obelisks and tomb walls stared out at the world, a magnificent and utterly impenetrable mystery. What stories were locked inside those stone pages? What secrets of a lost civilization were waiting just beyond understanding? The answer would lie in a single, fractured slab of black granite found by soldiers digging a fort in the Nile Delta. But that discovery, and the man who would become its key, was still centuries in the future. To master these sacred and practical marks was to hold a key to the very machinery of the state. In both Sumer and Egypt, the scribe was not merely a clerk, he was a member of a privileged, powerful caste. Literacy was a closely guarded technology, and the path to wielding it was long, arduous, and often reserved for the sons of the elite. From a very young age, a boy destined for the scribble class would be sent to the Adaba in Mesopotamia, the tablet house, or to a school attached to an Egyptian temple or palace. His education would stretch for years, a relentless drill in memorization, precision, and discipline. In Mesopotamia, the student's world was clay. He began by learning to prepare the perfect tablet, kneading the damp earth to just the right consistency. Then came the endless practice of forming the basic wedges with his stylus, horizontal, vertical, and diagonal, until his hand moved with unconscious accuracy. Only after mastering these building blocks could he start copying lists, thousands of them, of signs, words, and professional terminology for trees, animals, stones, and titles. The work was monotonous and the masters were strict. We know this because the students themselves left us a record of their frustrations. Archaeologists have found practice tablets where a young scribe, after rows of painstaking cuneiform, suddenly scrawled in the corner, "My head hurts." Or "The scribe is hungry, give him bread." Another tablet records a student being caned for talking, for standing up, for wearing dirty clothes. The message was clear: this sacred skill demanded absolute conformity. In Egypt, the medium was different, but the rigor was the same. A student trained for years with reed brush and ink on flakes of limestone or pottery shards, practicing the elegant curves of hundreds of hieroglyphs and their cursive shorthand form, hieratic. He copied classic texts extolling the virtues of the scribble life over all others. One such text admonishes, "Be a scribe. Your limbs will be sleek, your hands will grow soft. You will go forth in white clothes, honored, with courtiers saluting you." It was a powerful sales pitch for a life of the mind over the backbreaking labor of the farmer or soldier. And it was true. A successful scribe could rise to become a treasurer, a vizier, a royal ambassador. He could draft laws, calculate taxes, record history, and compose poetry. His words could command armies, distribute grain, or ensure a pharaoh's name lived for eternity. In a world where most people communicated only through speech, the scribe was the bridge between thought and permanent action. He was the human engine of administration, and his carefully formed symbols were the gears that made the civilization turn. This exclusivity, however, created a great divide. For centuries, the power of recorded knowledge was held in the hands of a very few. What would happen when that power finally began to spread? The scribe's monopoly on memory could not last forever. While the great river civilizations perfected their scripts, other ancient peoples, separated by vast oceans and impassable mountains, were wrestling with the same fundamental urge. In a remarkable display of human ingenuity, writing was not a single invention that spread from one source, but a brilliant idea that dawned independently in at least 3 other corners of the world, each culture finding its own unique voice in marks and symbols. In the fertile Indus Valley, a sophisticated urban culture thrived along the banks of a great river, much like Sumer and Egypt. The cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, flourishing over 4,000 years ago, were marvels of planning with advanced drainage systems and standardized bricks. And they too had a script. We find it on small, square stone seals, often depicting animals like the majestic humped bull, accompanied by short lines of elegant, stylized symbols. Some signs look like abstract stick figures, others like containers or simple tools. To this day, the Indus Valley script remains one of history's most tantalizing locked doors. Despite over a century of study, with thousands of these short inscriptions discovered, no one has definitively cracked its code. Is it a logographic system like early hieroglyphs? Is it a syllabary? We simply do not know. The language it records is lost, and the inscriptions are too brief to provide the repetitive patterns needed for a breakthrough. Each tiny seal is a silent message from a magnificent, organized society that simply will not speak to us, a permanent and profound mystery etched in stone. Far to the east, another script emerged from the cracks of fortune. In China, during the Shang Dynasty over 3,000 years ago, the future of writing was being read in the scorched bones of oxen and the shells of turtles. This was the oracle bone script. The Shang kings lived in a world intimately connected to the spirit realm. Before any major decision, a military campaign, the founding of a city, even the outcome of the royal hunt, they would seek divine counsel. A priest would inscribe a question onto a carefully prepared bone or shell. Then, applying intense heat, they would watch for the cracks that formed. The pattern of these cracks was believed to be the answer from the ancestors. What makes these artifacts so extraordinary is the writing itself. The inscriptions are the direct ancestor of modern Chinese characters. You can see the pictorial origins clearly, a simple drawing of a mountain, the sun above the horizon, a hand, but they had already evolved beyond mere pictures. They were a fully functional writing system used to record not just divinations, but also astronomical events, harvests, and royal genealogies. Here, writing began as a sacred dialogue with the unseen world, a way to make the whispers of the gods permanently visible in the network of cracks on a turtle's plastron. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, in the dense rainforests and highlands of Mesoamerica, a final independent birth of writing was taking shape. The Olmec civilization, often called the mother culture of the region, may have been the first to experiment with glyphic symbols as early as 900 years before the Common Era. But it was the Maya, centuries later, who would elevate it to a breathtaking art and science. The Maya script is a complex logosyllabic system, a mix of logograms that represent whole words and syllabic signs that represent sounds, allowing for incredible flexibility and expression. They carved it into towering stone stelae that recorded the precise dates of royal births, accessions, and battles within an intricate calendar system, so accurate it makes our heads spin. They painted it in vibrant colors on ceramic vessels and in sacred books called codices. With it, they wrote historical narratives, poetry, and detailed astronomical tables predicting the movements of Venus. The Maya proved that the drive to record, to calculate, and to tell stories through permanent symbols was a universal human spark, one that could ignite under the canopy of a rainforest as surely as in the shadow of a pyramid on the Nile. This pattern is what is so truly staggering. Isolated by continents, these cultures had no way of knowing about the clay tablets of Sumer or the papyrus scrolls of Egypt. Yet, faced with the growing complexity of their societies, the need to track time, legitimize rulers, record trades, and honor their gods, they each arrived at the same monumental solution. They invented systems to trap spoken language in a physical form. It is a powerful testament to a shared human instinct, a deep-seated need to reach out of our own moment in time and say, "We were here." This is what we knew, this is what we believed. Writing was not a single lucky discovery, it was an inevitable breakthrough in the story of us. And with these scripts now carrying the weight of kingdoms and the questions of kings, they demanded something more durable than clay, bone, or stone to write upon. They needed a surface that was light, portable, and abundant. They needed a revolution not in symbols but in substance. Yet for all their power, the great scripts of the ancient world came with a heavy price, a steep learning curve measured in years of a scribe's life. Mastering hundreds, even thousands of intricate signs was a monumental task that kept the power of writing locked within a small, elite class. But what if there was a simpler key? What if you could capture every word in your language with just a few dozen basic marks? That revolutionary idea did not come from a royal court or a temple school. It was born in the dust of a desert mine, forged by people who needed a practical tool for everyday survival. Around 1800 years before the Common Era, in the harsh Sinai Peninsula, Canaanite laborers toiled in Egyptian turquoise mines under the watchful eyes of Pharaoh's overseers. These workers were caught between two worlds, familiar with the elegant but impossibly complex hieroglyphs of their Egyptian masters, yet speaking their own Semitic language. They needed a way to write down their own names, to mark ownership, to leave simple messages for each other, but they had neither the time nor the privilege to spend a lifetime learning the sacred carvings. So they did something brilliantly pragmatic. They looked at the Egyptian system and took only its most basic, powerful principle, the idea that a sign could represent a sound. Then they stripped away everything else. They ignored the complex logograms and the silent determinatives. Instead, they selected a small set of simple Egyptian hieroglyphs and assigned each one to the first sound of the Semitic word for that object. This is called the acrophonic principle. For example, they took the hieroglyph for house, which in their language was bait. They then let that pictogram stand for the sound B. The sign for water, mem, became the sound M. The image of a hand, cap, became the sound K. With this elegant hack, they created the world's first alphabet, the Proto-Sinaitic script. It was a system of perhaps just 30 signs, where one mark consistently represented one consonant sound. This was a staggering simplification. Instead of memorizing 1,000 symbols to write a letter, you only needed to learn the small set of sounds in your spoken language and match them to their signs. The implications were quietly earth-shattering. Literacy was no longer a mountain to climb, it was a hill. This alphabet was not used for royal decrees or epic poetry, at least not at first. We find it scratched onto rock faces in the Sinai and on small stone slabs. Recording simple dedications like this is the offering of Baalat. It was a tool for practical people. And like any good tool, it was portable. As these Canaanite traders and workers moved, they carried this revolutionary technology with them. Over centuries, their alphabet evolved, its shapes simplifying further as it traveled up the Mediterranean coast. It was adopted and adapted by the Phoenicians, a seafaring merchant culture for whom efficient record-keeping was a matter of commercial life and death. Their version, with just 22 consonant letters, became the engine of their trading empire. From this Phoenician script, branches would grow in all directions, giving rise to the Hebrew and Aramaic alphabets, and eventually, carried across the sea by Greek merchants, it would inspire the Greek alphabet, which added something crucial: letters for vowel sounds. That Greek alphabet would become the ancestor of Latin, Cyrillic, and ultimately, the very letters you are hearing now. All of it can be traced back to that moment of ingenious simplification in the desert, when workers decided that the power of writing should not be a mystery guarded by priests, but a tool shaped by human hands. But a tool is only as powerful as its reach. The genius of the alphabet lay dormant until it found its perfect messengers, a people whose world was defined not by vast inland empires, but by the endless blue horizon of the sea. Around 1,050 years before the Common Era, the Phoenicians emerged from the coastal cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos as the undisputed masters of Mediterranean trade. Their ships, laden with vibrant purple dye from sea snails, precious cedar wood, and exquisite glassware, became floating arcs of civilization, connecting ports from North Africa to Sicily, Sardinia, and beyond. For these merchants, time was money and clarity was everything. A misplaced symbol on a bill of lading could mean a lost fortune. A misread contract could spark a war. The cumbersome cuneiform of the East or the sacred hieroglyphs of Egypt were utterly useless for the fast-paced, practical needs of their commerce. They needed a writing system that was fast to learn, quick to write, and unambiguous for their far-flung agents. In the simple, consonant-based alphabet they inherited and refined, they found their perfect instrument. The Phoenician alphabet was stripped down for speed, consisting of just 22 letters, all representing consonants. They wrote from right to left in clean, linear strokes, perfect for scratching into wax tablets or marking clay tags for cargo. It was the spreadsheet of the ancient world. Imagine a Phoenician merchant in a bustling port. He does not have years to train his scribes. He needs his nephew to learn the accounts by next season. With this alphabet, he could teach him the sounds of their language and their corresponding signs in a matter of weeks, not decades. This democratization of writing transformed their business. They could now keep precise inventories, draft clear contracts with foreign partners, and send instructions to captains across the sea. The alphabet was no longer just for recording history or praising gods. It became the engine of a globalized economy, a tool for creating wealth and building networks. And as they traded goods, they inevitably traded their script. In every port, at every trading post, the Phoenicians left more than just jars of dye. They left the idea of the alphabet itself. Local people, from Greek sailors to Italian craftsmen, saw this efficient system and recognized its power. They did not simply borrow it, they adapted it, making it their own. The Greeks, encountering this script around the 8th century before the Common Era, performed a crucial upgrade. They took some of the Phoenician consonant letters that represented sounds not present in Greek and repurposed them to represent vowel sounds. This addition made the written word an even more precise mirror of speech. From the Greek adaptation, in turn, would spring the Etruscan alphabet on the Italian peninsula, and from that, the Latin script used by the Romans, which would eventually march across Europe and much of the world. Another branch, the Aramaic alphabet, carried east by trade and empire, would give rise to the Hebrew and Arabic scripts. So the next time you read a street sign, a text message, or a novel, remember that the very shapes of the letters trace a direct line back to the account books of Phoenician merchants. They proved that the most revolutionary ideas are often the most practical ones, and that sometimes the thing that changes the world is not a grand philosophical treatise, but a simple, well-kept ledger. Yet for all its efficiency, this spreading alphabet still faced a fundamental limitation. It demanded something to write on, a surface that was lighter than stone, cheaper than papyrus, and more durable than wax. The story of writing was about to meet its perfect partner, born from a secret in an imperial workshop. The Phoenician alphabet traveled on ships, but it needed a surface that could travel just as easily. For centuries, the great scripts had been bound to heavy, permanent, or cumbersome materials. Cuneiform was pressed into thick clay tablets that weighed down archives. Hieroglyphs were carved laboriously into stone for eternity. The new, fast alphabets demanded something different, something that could keep pace with thought itself. That surface was born not from stone or mud, but from the quiet marshes of the Nile Delta. Around 3,000 years before the Common Era, the ancient Egyptians looked at the tall, triangular reeds growing in abundance along the riverbanks and saw more than just a plant. They saw the future of the written word. They called it papyrus, and its invention was as ingenious as any alphabet. The process began with harvesting the papyrus plant, which could grow over 15 feet tall. Workers would carefully cut the green outer rind away from the white, spongy pith inside. This pith was then sliced into long, thin strips, almost like vegetable noodles. The true magic happened next. A craftsman would lay a row of these strips side by side on a damp board, their edges slightly overlapping. Then he would place a second layer directly on top, but this time the strips were laid crosswise, perpendicular to the first layer. This cross-hatching was the key. The board was then covered with a cloth and pounded with a mallet for a long time. This pounding, combined with the natural sap of the plant, acted as a glue. The layers fused together into a single, cohesive sheet. Finally, the sheet was placed under a heavy stone to dry, and once hardened, its surface was polished smooth with a stone or a piece of ivory. The result was a material that was nothing short of miraculous. It was strong yet flexible, surprisingly durable, and had a beautifully smooth, pale surface that drank up ink from a reed pen. For the first time, you could write a long letter, a detailed contract, or an entire story on a surface that could be rolled up and carried in one hand. A single sheet was a pagina, but by gluing many sheets together end to end, the Egyptians created scrolls that could stretch for dozens of feet, enabling documents of unprecedented length and complexity. Papyrus became the lifeblood of Egyptian administration and culture. It recorded everything from tax rolls and temple inventories to medical texts, magical spells, and literary masterpieces like the Tale of Sinu. Its value was immense, and it quickly became one of Egypt's most coveted exports. Across the Mediterranean, the civilizations of Greece and Rome grew utterly dependent on shipments of these precious scrolls. Libraries and government offices from Athens to Rome ran on Egyptian papyrus. It was the medium upon which the works of Plato, the laws of the Roman Senate, and the letters of the early Christian Church were preserved. For over 3,000 years, papyrus was the dominant writing surface of the Western world, the fragile, beautiful bridge that carried knowledge from the ancient world into our own. Yet it had a vulnerability. It was a product of a single, specific ecosystem, the Nile marshes. Its production was a guarded state monopoly, and its supply could be threatened by politics, war, or a bad harvest. The world of writing, now accustomed to lightness and portability, needed a more reliable, more universal solution. That solution would not come from a riverbank, but from a workshop deep within a rival empire, born from a secret its inventor hoped would save his career. While papyrus scrolls unrolled across the Mediterranean, a different kind of surface was being perfected in places where the papyrus reed could not grow. In the drier climates of the Near East and later across Europe, scribes turned to a material that was always close at hand, one that came from the very animals that sustained their communities. They began to write on skin. This material, known as parchment, and its luxurious cousin vellum, would become the defining medium of the medieval world, prized for its remarkable strength and versatility. The process of creating it, however, was not for the faint of heart. It began with the skin of a sheep, goat, or, for the finest quality, a calf. The fresh hide was first soaked in a lime solution for days to loosen the hair and fat. Then the craftsman would stretch it tightly on a wooden frame, a process called a hearse. With a special moon-shaped knife with a curved blade, he would begin the meticulous work of scraping. All the remaining flesh and hair had to be scraped away from one side, and then the hide was flipped to scrape the other, thinning it uniformly. This was repeated again and again, with the skin constantly wetted and tightened on the frame until it achieved a perfect paper-thin smoothness. The final step was drying it under tension, which gave parchment its famous taut, stiff quality. The result was a writing surface of incredible durability, one that could last for centuries if kept dry. Unlike papyrus, which was only smooth on one side and could crack if folded, parchment was flexible and could be written on both sides. This was a revolutionary advantage. It meant that instead of long, cumbersome scrolls, scribes could now fold large sheets and bind them together along one edge, creating the very first books as we recognize them today, the Codex. This new form was easier to reference, more compact to store, and far more resilient. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of parchment was its scarcity and value. Producing a single large Bible could require the skins of over 200 animals, making books astonishingly expensive treasures. This high cost led to a remarkable practice. When a text was no longer needed or was deemed less important, scribes did not simply throw the precious parchment away. Instead, they would take a finished book and carefully scrape or wash the ink from its pages. They would then reuse the surface to write an entirely new text. These recycled manuscripts are called palimpsests, from Greek words meaning scraped again. To the naked eye, they appear to contain only the newer writing, but for centuries, hidden just beneath the surface, the original erased texts lay dormant. It was not until the 19th century, with the advent of ultraviolet light and later multispectral imaging, that scholars could begin to peer beneath the upper layer. What they found was nothing short of a time capsule. Famous lost works of the ancient Greek mathematician Archimedes were discovered under the pages of a medieval prayer book. Early versions of the Bible, classical Roman law texts, and forgotten speeches by Cicero have all been recovered from these ghostly undertexts. Each palimpsest is a silent battle between two eras, a desperate act of preservation born from necessity, where the very act of erasing one text to save parchment ended up preserving another for a future that could finally see it. The skin of an animal treated with such care became more than just a page. It became a layered archive, holding the whispers of the past in a delicate, invisible ink, waiting for a light that had not yet been invented to give them voice once more. Yet for all its layered history, parchment was a material of immense labor and limited supply. Far to the east, in the Han Dynasty of ancient China, a different kind of revolution was quietly brewing, one that would solve the problem of writing surfaces for the entire world. The Chinese had long been masters of record-keeping, but their early materials presented profound challenges. The sacred oracle bones of the Shang dynasty were powerful for divination, but you could hardly write a long treatise on a shoulder blade. Bronze vessels carried inscriptions of great importance, yet casting a single document in metal was a monumental undertaking. For everyday writing and administration, two materials dominated, and each had a critical flaw. The first was bamboo. Scribes would split bamboo stalks into thin slips, then write a vertical line of characters on each strip with a brush and ink. To compose a longer text, they would drill holes in the slips and lace them together with cord into a flexible, if incredibly cumbersome, book. A single report to the emperor could require a cartload of these bamboo slips, heavy and awkward to transport. The alternative was silk. This luxurious fabric, smooth and lightweight, was a beautiful surface for writing or painting with a brush, but its cost was astronomical. Producing silk was a slow, secretive process, and the resulting cloth was a treasure reserved for the elite. To write a book on silk was a display of staggering wealth, not a practical solution for a growing empire that needed to educate officials, spread laws, and keep meticulous records. The contradiction was clear. China was a civilization bursting with ideas, yet it was trapped between a material that was too heavy and one that was too precious. The empire needed something new, something that could carry words as lightly as silk, but could be made as commonly as bamboo. The ingredients for this miracle were already scattered throughout every household and workshop, waiting for someone to see their potential. There were old hemp fishing nets discarded and fraying. There were rags of linen and cloth worn thin from use, and there was the inner bark of the mulberry tree, a fibrous layer that papermakers would later call bast. These were the humble, overlooked threads of daily life. No one looked at a pile of old rags and saw a library. No one examined mulberry bark and imagined the pages of a book. But in the workshop of a court official named Cai Lun, these forgotten fibers were about to be transformed. The stage was set not in a pristine laboratory, but in a practical space where necessity, imperial pressure, and available resources were about to collide into one of humanity's most transformative inventions. The pressure for a new medium was building within the Han Dynasty court itself. Emperor, he needed a reliable, efficient way to manage the mountains of bureaucratic records that held his empire together, and the current options were failing him. Into this logistical crisis stepped a brilliant and ambitious court official named Cai Lun. Around the year 105 of the Common Era, this eunuch administrator, overseeing the imperial workshops, presented the emperor with a solution that was both elegantly simple and utterly revolutionary. He offered a new kind of sheet, smooth, lightweight, and strong, crafted not from rare silk or heavy bamboo, but from the humblest of materials. His reported recipe reads like a list of discarded scraps, mulberry tree bark, bits of hemp, old rags, and even frayed fishing nets. But in Cai Lun's hands, these worthless fibers became the foundation of knowledge itself. The process he perfected was a work of practical genius. First, these tough materials were soaked and beaten in water for a long time, breaking them down into a tangled, soggy mass of individual fibers. This created a pulpy slurry, a thick soup of potential. Then the artisan would dip a flat, woven screen, likely made from fine bamboo strips, into the vat. As he lifted it out, a thin layer of the watery pulp was caught across the mesh. The water would drain away, leaving a fragile, wet mat of interlocked fibers on the screen's surface. This fragile sheet was then carefully peeled off, pressed to remove more water, and finally dried against a heated wall or in the sun. The result was paper. What made Cai Lun's contribution so monumental was not necessarily that he invented it from nothing. Archaeological finds suggest crude, paper-like sheets may have existed in China for a century or two before him. His genius was in refinement, standardization, and promotion. He identified the best, most cost-effective mix of fibers, perfected the screen molding technique for consistent quality, and most importantly, he presented it officially to the throne. With the emperor's enthusiastic endorsement, papermaking transformed from a scattered craft into a state-supported industry. The imperial court now had the perfect medium for its endless edicts and tax records, a surface that was cheap to produce, easy to store, and could be written on with the swift strokes of a brush. Cai Lun was rewarded with high nobility and great wealth, a testament to the world-changing value of his practical recipe. Yet, for a long time, the secret of how to turn rags and bark into sheets of thought remained a closely guarded treasure of the Chinese Empire, a technological advantage as potent as any army. The question was not if this miracle would spread, but how, and what stories would it carry when it finally broke free from the palace walls. The secret of papermaking began with a kind of alchemy, transforming rough, useless fibers into a surface smooth as silk. It started with the raw ingredients, often the inner bark of the mulberry tree, old hemp ropes, or discarded linen rags. These tough materials were not simply chopped up, they were patiently broken down. Workers would first soak the fibers in water for weeks, allowing them to soften and ferment. This natural rotting process, guided by time and microorganisms, started to separate the long, sturdy cellulose strands from the other plant matter, leaving behind the essential building blocks of paper. Once sufficiently softened, the wet, soggy mass was moved to a stone trough. Here, the real physical work began. Craftsmen would beat the pulp relentlessly with large wooden mallets, pounding it for hours. This was not random violence, it was a precise technique. The goal was to tease apart the individual fibers, to bruise and fray their ends so that later, when they settled together, they would grab onto each other like a million tiny hands interlocking. The rhythm of the hammers was the heartbeat of the workshop, a steady percussion transforming a coarse mash into a fine, silky slurry suspended in water. The magic of sheet formation happened next with a tool of elegant simplicity, the mold and decal. The mold was a flat, rectangular frame strung with a fine mesh, usually made from thin strips of bamboo woven together. The decal was a removable rim that sat on top of it, creating a shallow, walled tray. A skilled worker would dip this paired tool into the vat of slurry, lifting it out with a swift, level motion. As the water drained through the bamboo mesh, it left behind a perfectly even layer of interlocked fibers, a ghostly, wet sheet of paper. The consistency of this lift was everything, a flick of the wrist determining the final sheet's thickness and uniformity. The decal was then removed and the fragile, waterlogged mat remained on the mold. This newborn sheet was too delicate to touch. The worker would carefully invert the mold onto a stack of felt or coarse cloth, transferring the paper onto a waiting pile. He would repeat this process again and again, building a stack of alternating layers, one wet paper sheet, one piece of absorbent felt. This stack, called a post, was then placed under enormous pressure. A heavy wooden screw press turned by hand would squeeze down, forcing the remaining water out and pressing the fibers into an even tighter, more cohesive bond. After pressing, the sheets were still damp. They were then peeled from their felt blankets and brushed onto smooth, heated walls, often made of plaster or brick. The gentle warmth would dry them flat and taut. The final product was a revelation, a material that was strong yet flexible, thirsty for ink, and astonishingly uniform. Compared to the weight of bamboo slips or the astronomical cost of silk, this was a democratizing miracle. A single vat of pulp made from the bark of a few trees or a bundle of old rags could produce hundreds of sheets. The empire now had a medium that could keep pace with its bureaucratic mind. A blank page waiting for every order, every poem, and every idea yet to be born. This recipe, however, was a state secret, a treasure as valuable as any spice or jewel. Its journey beyond the borders of China would not be a story of open trade, but one of stealth, conflict, and prisoners of war. That recipe for paper was a treasure more valuable than gold, and the Chinese Empire guarded it with the vigilance of a dragon hoarding its jewels. For nearly 6 centuries after Cai Lun's presentation to the throne, the art of turning rags and bark into sheets of knowledge remained a fiercely protected state secret. The government established official, state-run paper mills, controlling every stage of production from the collection of raw hemp and mulberry to the final, polished sheets. Export of the technology was strictly forbidden. This was not merely about preserving a profitable industry, it was about maintaining a critical strategic advantage. Paper was the nervous system of imperial administration, allowing the emperor's will to be communicated swiftly and clearly across vast distances. It enabled a standardized education for the vast bureaucracy that ran the state. To let this technology slip beyond the borders would be to hand a rival the very tools of power and organization. So, while finished paper itself did travel, bundled into bales and carried by merchants, the knowledge of how to make it did not. The West remained dependent on expensive parchment and fragile papyrus, looking upon these smooth, strong sheets from the East as exotic curiosities, never knowing the simple alchemy that created them. The secret's journey westward would not be a story of diplomacy or trade, but one written in the dust of a distant battlefield. It began with a slow, creeping diffusion along the threads of the Silk Road. As merchants and Buddhist monks traveled the arduous routes through Central Asia, they carried not only silks and spices but also paper scrolls and documents. By the 6th century, paper was being used in small quantities in the oasis cities of the Tarim Basin, like Turfan, but it was still an imported luxury, not a locally produced staple. The knowledge of how to create it remained bottled up within China's heartland, a mystery locked behind the Great Wall and imperial decree. Then, in the year 751, history turned on a single, brutal clash of empires in a remote valley. The Battle of Tollers, fought in what is now Kyrgyzstan, pitted the expanding forces of the Tang dynasty against the advancing armies of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Chinese forces were defeated, and in the chaotic aftermath, the Abbasid victors took thousands of prisoners. Among these captives, the chronicles tell us, were skilled craftsmen, including, crucially, papermakers from the Chinese heartland. These unwilling experts were taken west to the flourishing Abbasid city of Samarkand, a crossroads of culture and commerce. Here, the Caliphate's rulers, renowned for their patronage of science and practical arts, recognized the immense value of their prisoners' knowledge. They provided the craftsmen with the materials they needed. Mulberry trees grew abundantly in the region and set them to work. Soon, the first paper mill outside of East Asia was established in Samarkand. The city's location was perfect, with ample running water for the pounding mills and a central position on the trade routes. Samarkand paper quickly became famous for its exquisite quality, smooth, white, and durable. It was said to be superior even to the Chinese product. From this single point of leakage, the technology began to radiate outward, no longer a secret but a spreading flame. Baghdad saw its first mill by the end of the 8th century, then Damascus and Cairo followed. The Islamic world, with its vibrant culture of scholarship, poetry, and administrative sophistication, embraced paper with an enthusiasm that would forever alter the course of global knowledge. Samarkand was just the beginning. With the secret of papermaking now loose in the world, it spread with the speed of a revelation. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, was a civilization built on the pursuit of knowledge, and it recognized in paper a tool of unimaginable power. By the end of the 8th century, the first paper mill in Baghdad was established, and soon others followed in Damascus, Cairo, and across North Africa. Each city refined the process, developing larger, more efficient mills powered by water wheels to automate the laborious pounding of pulp. This was industrialization on an ancient scale, turning what was once a painstaking craft into a thriving, productive industry. The result was a flood of cheap, reliable writing material. For the first time in the West, the cost of a book was no longer tied to the skins of hundreds of animals. Paper was affordable, and that simple economic fact changed everything. Suddenly, the act of writing was liberated. Scholars, poets, doctors, and astronomers could draft and redraft their thoughts without fearing the waste of precious parchment. Scribes could produce copies of texts at a fraction of the former cost and time. This catalyzed an intellectual explosion known as the Islamic Golden Age. At its heart was a monumental project of translation and preservation. In the great library and research center of Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, teams of scholars worked tirelessly. They gathered ancient texts from the far corners of the known world, scrolls of papyrus and codices of parchment containing the works of Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, the medical theories of Galen, the geometry of Euclid, the astronomy of Ptolemy, along with Persian epics and Indian mathematical treatises. These works were translated into Arabic, the lingua franca of scholarship, and copied onto fresh, durable sheets of paper. Think of it as the world's first major data migration, rescuing the collective knowledge of antiquity from fragile, decaying formats and transferring it onto a new, stable, and infinitely reproducible platform. Without this paper-backed effort, much of Greek philosophy and science might have been lost forever during Europe's early Middle Ages, a time when such classical learning was often neglected or forgotten. Paper did not just preserve old ideas, it accelerated new ones. Muslim scholars, armed with this accessible medium, built upon the translated knowledge. The mathematician Al-Khwarizmi wrote his foundational texts on algebra, a word derived from the title of his book. The physician Al-Razi compiled vast medical encyclopedias. All of this was written, shared, and debated on paper. The love of books became a cultural hallmark. Public and private libraries, unheard of in scale since the Library of Alexandria, sprang up in major cities. A single library in Cordoba, in the Islamic realm of Al-Andalus in Spain, was said to house over 400,000 volumes, a number that would have been physically and financially impossible using only parchment. Paper made the democratization of knowledge a tangible reality. A merchant could own a copy of poetry, a student could afford a treatise on law, a doctor could reference a detailed anatomical diagram. This was the true revolution, the transformation of writing from an instrument of state and church into a tool for the curious mind. While Europe's monasteries quietly preserved a handful of precious parchment manuscripts, the Islamic world was buzzing with paper-based scholarship, creating a beacon of learning that would eventually shine back into the continent it had once helped to educate. But how would this paper revolution cross the final frontier, moving from the sophisticated cities of Al-Andalus into the heart of a Europe still scribbling on sheepskin? The bridge would be built not by scholars but by soldiers and traders in a place of fierce conflict and unexpected exchange. The paper revolution needed a bridge into the heart of Europe, and that bridge was built in the sun-drenched hills of Spain. While the great libraries of Al-Andalus were filled with paper books, the technology itself remained largely confined to the Islamic world for centuries. But as the Christian kingdoms of the north slowly pushed south in the long campaign known as the Reconquista, they did not just capture territory, they captured knowledge. In the 11th and 12th centuries, with the fall of cities like Toledo, the secret of papermaking was no longer a distant rumor. It was a functioning industry now under new management. The first paper mill in Christian Europe was established in the town of Zátiva, near Valencia, around the year 1150. From this foothold in Iberia, the idea traveled along Mediterranean trade routes, reaching the multicultural island of Sicily, another point of exchange between Arab, Norman, and Italian cultures. But it was in a small, unassuming town in the Apennine Mountains of Italy that European papermaking would find its true home and undergo a transformation of its own. That town was Fabriano. Nestled in a steep river valley, Fabriano possessed the perfect ingredients for an industrial miracle. Fast-flowing streams provided clean, soft water and reliable power. Vast forests supplied the raw materials for fuel and for the ash needed in processing. Most importantly, the town was filled with skilled metalworkers, masters of forging the precise tools required for a new kind of mill. By the 13th century, Fabriano was not just making paper, it was reinventing the process with a series of brilliant innovations that would set the standard for centuries. Their first breakthrough was mechanical. Instead of relying on men with heavy mallets to pound pulp for hours, the Fabriano craftsmen harnessed the power of their mountain streams. They adapted the technology of the water-powered trip hammer, commonly used for fulling cloth or forging metal, to the paper mill. A water wheel turned a camshaft which lifted a series of large wooden hammers, releasing them to fall with tremendous, rhythmic force into stone troughs filled with rag pulp. This mechanical beating was faster, more consistent, and far less exhausting than human labor. It produced a finer, more uniform fiber slurry, which in turn yielded a stronger, smoother sheet of paper. This was the beginning of true paper industry, where production could be scaled up dramatically, but strength and smoothness were not enough. The paper arriving from the Islamic world had a flaw for European scribes: it was too absorbent. The inks used in Europe, often iron gall ink, would bleed and feather on the unsized paper, creating blurry, messy lines. The Fabriano papermakers solved this with a second innovation: sizing. After the sheets were formed and dried, they were dipped into a vat of liquid animal gelatin, made by boiling the skins and bones of rabbits or other animals. This gelatin bath coated the individual paper fibers, creating a barrier. Once dried again, the paper's surface became resistant to ink bleed, allowing for the crisp, sharp lines needed for the intricate Gothic script of medieval manuscripts. Now paper could rival parchment for clarity and beauty at a fraction of the cost. Their final touch was one of pride and practicality: the watermark. As the wet sheet of paper was formed on its mold, the craftsman would attach a simple wire design, like a stylized letter, a symbol, or a local emblem, to the mesh screen. Where this wire lay, the paper pulp would be slightly thinner. When the sheet dried and was held up to the light, this thinner area would appear as a translucent image. This was not just a maker's mark for branding, it was a guarantee of quality and origin. A merchant in Venice could hold a sheet to a window, see the distinctive crown or anchor of a Fabriano mill, and know he was getting the best product available. The watermark was a silent signature woven into the very fabric of the page, a testament to the craft and a tool against forgery. With these three advances, the water-powered hammer mill, animal gelatin sizing, and artistic watermarking, Fabriano paper became the gold standard. It fueled the rise of the Italian Renaissance, providing the material for the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, the sonnets of Petrarch, and the ledgers of Florentine bankers. The humble combination of rags, water, and human ingenuity had now been perfected. Paper was ready to meet its ultimate partner, a machine that could replicate words not with the careful stroke of a pen, but with the swift, mechanical kiss of type. The quiet, rhythmic scratch of a quill in a monastic scriptorium was the sound of knowledge being saved, one agonizingly slow word at a time. In a cold stone room, a monk would spend months, sometimes years, hunched over a single manuscript. His tools were simple: a sharpened goose feather, a pot of ink, and a stretched precious skin of parchment. Every letter of a biblical passage, every diagram in a scientific text had to be drawn by hand with meticulous care. A single mistake could mean scraping the entire expensive page clean and starting over. This was the bottleneck of the medieval mind. Books were rare treasures, so costly that only the wealthiest institutions like cathedrals or royal courts could hope to own a library. The ideas contained within them were held in a kind of sacred captivity, accessible to a vanishingly small fragment of society. The arrival of affordable paper from places like Fabriano began to loosen those chains, but it was only half the solution. You could now afford the surface, but you still needed a faster way to put the words onto it. The act of creation remained shackled to the speed of a single human hand. What was needed was a machine that could remember the shape of a letter and then repeat it perfectly, endlessly, at a pace no scribe could ever match. That machine was born in a workshop in Mainz, Germany, in the 1440s, from the mind of a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg. His genius was not in inventing something entirely new, but in combining existing technologies into a system of revolutionary efficiency. He took the concept of the coin punch, used to stamp images into metal currency, and adapted it to create precise, reusable molds for individual letters. He then developed a durable alloy of lead, tin, and antimony that would melt at a low temperature, cast cleanly, and withstand the pressure of repeated printing. From these molds, he could produce hundreds of identical copies of a single letter, a lowercase e, a capital T, a question mark. This was movable type. A typesetter could now arrange these individual metal pieces into a frame, composing a full page of text, locking it into place, and then, crucially, reusing the letters again for the next page. The second part of his system was the adaptation of the screw press, a common tool used for making wine or pressing cloth. Gutenberg modified it to apply a perfectly even, forceful pressure. He would ink the assembled type, place a sheet of dampened paper over it, and lower the press. With one pull of a lever, the entire page was transferred onto the paper, crisp and uniform. But this mechanical miracle would have been stillborn without its perfect partner. Imagine trying to print the Gutenberg Bible, a work of over 1,200 pages on parchment. The demand for animal skins would have been astronomical, the cost prohibitive, and the varying thickness and texture of the skins would have made consistent printing nearly impossible. Paper was the missing ingredient that made the press truly world-changing. It was flat, uniform, and absorbent enough to take a clean impression from the ink type. Most importantly, it was abundant and relatively cheap. Gutenberg's 42-line Bible, printed around 1455, required paper made from roughly 5,000 pounds of rags, a significant but ultimately manageable quantity. The combination was explosive. Where a scriptorium might produce 1 or 2 copies of a book in a year, a printing press with a team of workers could produce hundreds of identical copies in the same time. The cost of books plummeted. Ideas were no longer fragile, singular artifacts. They were suddenly commodities that could be replicated and distributed on an unprecedented scale. The world shifted from a culture of copying to a culture of publishing. Bibles could be read in common languages, not just Latin. scientific discoveries, political debates, and revolutionary philosophies could spread across continents in months instead of decades. The silent, solitary work of the monk in his cell was replaced by the rhythmic thump of the press, a sound that announced the beginning of a new era where knowledge finally broke free from the monastery and flowed into the streets, forever changing who could learn, what they could know, and how quickly they could share it. The rhythmic thump of the press was the sound of a cage door swinging open. For the first time in human history, the power of the written word was no longer chained to the speed of a single scribe's hand. This was not merely a faster way to make books, it was a complete rewiring of society's nervous system. Knowledge, once a scarce resource hoarded by elites in temples, palaces, and monasteries, began to flood into the public square. The combination of movable type and affordable paper created a new kind of currency, one made of ideas, and it was suddenly in wide circulation. A scholar in Florence could read a newly printed treatise on anatomy, its diagrams clear and consistent in every copy. A merchant in Antwerp could study a printed manual on double-entry bookkeeping, standardizing practices across continents. A farmer's son, if he could learn his letters, might access a printed grammar textbook, a possibility unimaginable just a century before. The monopoly on memory was broken. This democratization of knowledge became the engine for three earth-shattering movements that built the modern world. First came the Renaissance, a rebirth of classical learning that was fueled not by rediscovered manuscripts alone, but by the ability to print and distribute them. The works of Plato, long confined to a few dusty library shelves, could now be studied simultaneously by thinkers in Rome, Paris, and London. This shared textual foundation allowed for a common conversation across borders, sparking new art, literature, and a revolutionary focus on human potential. Then, building on that foundation, came the scientific revolution. When Nicolaus Copernicus proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun, his radical idea did not fade as a whispered heresy. It was printed, debated, and tested by others who had read the same diagrams and data. Galileo's observations of the moons of Jupiter were published in a pamphlet that circulated through Europe, inviting verification and debate. The scientific method itself relies on the precise, repeatable communication of experiments and results, a process made possible only by the printed page. It turned science from a solitary pursuit into a collaborative, cumulative project, accelerating discovery at a breathtaking pace. Perhaps the most immediate and explosive impact was on faith itself. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in 1517, it was the printing press that turned a local protest into the Protestant Reformation. Within weeks, Luther's arguments were printed in German, not scholarly Latin, and spread like wildfire. For the first time, individuals could read and interpret the Bible in their own language, thanks to mass-produced vernacular translations. This shattered the central authority of the Church and placed spiritual power directly into the hands of the literate believer, reshaping politics, culture, and the map of Europe forever. Beyond these great upheavals, writing and paper quietly built the framework of our daily lives. Modern administration, with its forms, passports, and contracts, runs on paper. Consistent laws are published and accessible, creating the rule of law. Global commerce depends on letters of credit, bills of lading, and stock certificates. Every one of these pillars of civilization rests on that fundamental ability to create a permanent, portable, and replicable record. From the first wedge pressed into clay to the printed page rolling off a Gutenberg press, this was the ultimate achievement, the creation of a shared, external memory for all of humanity. We had learned to take a thought, fragile and fleeting as a breath, and give it a body that could travel across space and time. It is the foundation upon which every story you have ever read, every law that protects you, and every scientific fact you rely upon is built, the silent, enduring scaffold of human progress. Yet this grand scaffold of human memory has always rested on fragile ground. For For every story saved by writing, countless others have vanished into silence, their pages turned to ash or dust. The burning of the Library of Alexandria stands as the eternal symbol of this loss, a single catastrophic fire that consumed an estimated 500,000 scrolls. Imagine the collective wisdom of the ancient world, the plays of Sophocles that we will never read, the detailed histories of lost civilizations, the scientific observations that could have accelerated human understanding by 1,000 years, all gone in a blaze. That library was not merely a building, it was the closest humanity ever came to a complete backup of its own mind, and its destruction left a permanent void in our story. But the vulnerability of knowledge is not only in dramatic fires, it is in the quiet, patient work of time itself. Clay tablets baked hard for permanence can shatter into fragments. Papyrus scrolls left in damp tombs crumble at a touch. Paper, for all its wonder, is prey to flame, to mold, to the simple acidity in its own fibers that turns it brittle and brown over the centuries. Every book is in a slow race against decay. This fragility has turned historians and archaeologists into detectives in a race against time, piecing together puzzles from the wreckage. Some of the most thrilling recoveries come from the most unlikely places. In the Roman town of Herculaneum, buried by the same volcanic eruption that destroyed Pompeii, a villa was found containing a library of papyrus scrolls. The intense heat of the pyroclastic flow did not burn them, it carbonized them, turning them into blackened, brittle logs that would disintegrate if unrolled by traditional means. For centuries, they were considered unreadable, beautiful but sealed tombs of text. Today, using advanced technology like multispectral imaging and even sophisticated X-ray techniques, scientists are virtually unwrapping these scrolls, revealing lost works of Greek philosophy right before our eyes. It is a digital resurrection, pulling words back from the brink of oblivion. Elsewhere, the challenge is not physical damage but a forgotten code. The Indus Valley script remains a tantalizing lock with no key, its symbols silent on hundreds of seals. The Linear, a script of the ancient Minoans, still guards its secrets. Deciphering a lost language is the ultimate intellectual heist, requiring a bilingual clue, like the Rosetta Stone, or a brilliant, intuitive leap to hear a voice that has been silent for millennia. Each recovered word, whether from a scanned scroll or a cracked cipher, is a victory in this endless campaign. It reminds us that preservation is not passive, it is a continuous, active choice. Every time a manuscript is digitized, a fragile document is placed in a climate-controlled archive, or a scholar pores over a fragment, we are fighting that same ancient battle, the one that began when the first scribe pressed a reed into clay, the battle to keep our stories alive against the relentless tide of forgetting. That battle against forgetting would soon require paper on an unimaginable scale. For centuries, the craft had remained remarkably similar to the process perfected in Fabriano, a slow, artisanal dance of vats, molds, and human skill. But as the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the world's hunger for the printed word exploded. Newspapers, novels, government documents, and school books were in demand everywhere. The old methods could not keep up. Paper was about to meet the machine age, and it would transform from a precious commodity into an everyday necessity. The breakthrough came from an English brothers named Henry and Seeley Fordrinier, who funded the development of a revolutionary device. The Fordrinier machine, patented in 1807, was a marvel of industrial ingenuity. Imagine a vast, rumbling assembly line for paper. Instead of a craftsman dipping a single mold into a vat, this machine took a continuous stream of watery pulp and poured it onto a fast-moving, endless belt of fine wire mesh. As the belt shook and raced along, water drained away through the mesh, leaving behind a fragile, wet mat of fibers. This mat then passed through a series of rollers that pressed it, dried it with heated cylinders, and finally wound the finished paper onto a giant spool at the end. For the first time in history, paper was not made sheet by painstaking sheet. It was born as an endless, unbroken river measured in miles per hour rather than sheets per day. This single invention turned papermaking from a craft into an industry, satisfying the insatiable demand of a newly literate and connected world. But this new river of paper required a new source of fiber. For millennia, paper had been made from linen and cotton rags, the worn-out clothing of society. As production skyrocketed, a rag shortage became a genuine crisis. Paper mills sent agents door to door to buy old cloth, and there were even tales of grave robbers stealing burial shrouds to sell to desperate mill owners. The solution was found not in the laundry basket but in the forest. In the 1840s, a German weaver named Friedrich Gottlob Keller experimented with grinding wood into a pulp, and soon after, chemical processes were developed to break down wood's tough lignin fibers. Wood pulp was a revelation. It was cheap, incredibly abundant, and it finally broke the bottleneck. Paper became truly ubiquitous, the disposable surface of modern life, from the morning newspaper to the packaging of a new product. Yet this revolutionary shift came with a hidden cost, one that would not reveal itself for generations. The chemical pulp and the alum rosin sizing used in this new paper left behind acidic residues. Slowly, inevitably, these acids began to eat away at the very paper they helped create. Books printed between the mid-19th and late 20th centuries began to suffer a slow, silent death. Their pages turned brittle and yellow, crumbling at the edges like autumn leaves. A reader might open a beloved novel from 1890, only to find the text block separating from its spine, the paper so fragile a turned page could snap. Libraries worldwide found themselves guardians of collections that were literally disintegrating on the shelves. This was the modern preservation mystery, a paradox where the very technology that democratized knowledge also doomed a century's worth of it to a slower chemical fire. Today, we are living with the legacy of both those revolutions, the miracle of abundance and the challenge of permanence. The environmental impact of wood pulp paper production, from deforestation to the chemicals used in bleaching, has sparked a global movement toward sustainable forestry and advanced recycling. We have learned to deacidify precious books, bathing their pages in a chemical buffer to neutralize the acids and give them centuries more of life. And the cycle of rags to paper has come full circle, with our recycled office paper and cardboard boxes forming a new loop in this ancient story. The substance that began with Cai Lun's mixture of bark and old nets continues to evolve, a testament to our unending need to record, to share, and to remember, even as we seek better ways to do it. The endless river of paper now flows beside a new, invisible current of light and electricity. We live in an age where a library of 10,000 books can rest on a device thinner than a single magazine, where a love letter can travel across the world in a heartbeat without ever touching a tree. The digital screen, with its infinite capacity for change and instant access, seems to render the physical page a charming anachronism. For communication, for business, for news, the argument for going paperless is compelling and urgent. Every email sent instead of a memo, every e-ticket scanned instead of a printed boarding pass, seems like a small victory for the forests, a reduction in the energy and water used by mills, a step toward a lighter environmental footprint. The dream of a truly paperless office, a paperless world, has been a tantalizing vision for decades, promising not just ecological benefits but a new kind of efficiency, where information is fluid, searchable, and instantly shareable. Yet, in the quiet of a study or the focused silence of a library, a persistent mystery remains. Why do so many of us, even the most digitally native among us, still reach for a physical book when we truly want to learn? Why do we print out that important contract to review it, or find that scribbled notes in a margin stick in our mind long after a typed list is forgotten? Science is beginning to uncover clues that paper engages our brains in a profoundly different way. Studies in cognitive psychology suggest that reading on paper provides what researchers call a haptic richness, a tangible sense of progress and place. You feel the weight of the pages shift from right to left. You see how far you have come and how far you have to go. This physical map of the text appears to support better comprehension and deeper memory retention, especially for longer, more complex narratives or arguments. The fixed, permanent nature of ink on a page might reduce the skimming and distractions that flickering screens can invite, allowing for a more immersive, contemplative state of mind. So we find ourselves at a curious crossroads, not facing a simple replacement, but a subtle division of labor. The digital realm excels at distribution, search, and connection, a dazzling nervous system for our global mind. Paper, however, seems to retain a cherished role as the tool for deep focus, for personal reflection, for the kind of learning that sinks into your bones. Perhaps paper will not vanish into obsolescence, but will retreat into the spaces we hold most sacred for thought, becoming the medium we choose not for speed but for substance. The future may not be paperless, but paper full of meaning, reserved for the words we want to feel, to remember, and to keep. Even with all we have uncovered, the past holds its secrets close. Our journey through the invention of writing leaves us not just with answers, but with profound and tantalizing questions, mysteries that remind us how much history is still a story waiting to be fully read. Consider the elegant symbols of the Indus Valley civilization, a script that has stared back at scholars for over a century. Found on thousands of small stone seals, these signs represent a sophisticated urban society with standardized weights, advanced plumbing, and trade networks stretching to Mesopotamia. Yet we cannot hear their voices. We do not know if these marks record a king's name, a merchant's prayer, or a poet's verse. The inscriptions are frustratingly short, and with no bilingual Rosetta Stone yet discovered, the language remains a locked door. Deciphering it would be like suddenly hearing the thoughts of a ghost, revealing the laws, myths, and daily concerns of a people who helped shape the ancient world, only to vanish into silence. Then there is the debate that challenges a core idea from our story, the concept of independent invention. We traced writing's birth in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica as separate sparks of genius. But some scholars look at the Olmec and Maya scripts and wonder, could there have been a single, forgotten point of origin? Could a seed of the idea have been carried across the Pacific in ancient times, perhaps by long-vanished voyages we have yet to uncover? The evidence is thin and hotly contested, but the possibility itself is thrilling. It suggests an even more interconnected ancient world than we ever imagined, where ideas might have traveled on currents we can no longer see. This is not just an academic puzzle, it is a question about the nature of human creativity itself. Are we a species of multiple inventors, or are we brilliant borrowers, passing a single, revolutionary flame from hand to hand across the millennia? And if these scripts we know about are mysteries, what of the ones we have lost entirely? History is written by the survivors, and the materials of memory are fragile. We know of civilizations that must have kept records on perishable surfaces, wood bark, painted cloth, or treated leather, materials that decayed in humid jungles or arid sands long before archaeologists could arrive. What stories vanished with them? What legal codes, astronomical observations, or epic poems were composed on surfaces that returned to dust? Every time a new tomb is unsealed or a shipwreck is found in deep, anoxic mud, there is a chance. Perhaps a sealed ceramic jar in a forgotten cave will one day yield a scroll from a culture we thought was illiterate. Perhaps a sunken trading vessel will hold a captain's logbook, written on a material we cannot yet identify, in a script that will rewrite a chapter of our shared past. The clay tablets and stone steels endured by chance, but they are only a fraction of the conversation. The rest of the ancient world's library is still out there, waiting in the darkness for the right moment and the right curious mind to bring it back into the light. The silent voices of the past are not as distant as they seem. You can hold a piece of this history in your own hands, and you do not need a time machine to do it. One of the most powerful ways to connect with the story of writing is to try the very actions that started it all. Let us begin with the very first marks. Find some air-dry clay, modeling clay, or even a thick slab of mud from the garden. Press it flat into a small tablet shape. Now take a chopstick, a popsicle stick, or even the rounded end of a pen. Do not drag it to draw a line. Press the tip into the clay at an angle, then lift it straight up. You have just made a wedge, the basic building block of cuneiform. Try making a series of these wedges in different patterns. How would you arrange them to represent a star or a house or your own name? You are not just playing with clay, you are using the same physical motion a Sumerian scribe used over 5,000 years ago, learning that writing began not as drawing, but as a deliberate act of pressure and impression. For the other great invention, you can become a paper maker. This activity is wonderfully simple and a bit messy, perfect for a curious afternoon. Gather some old scrap paper, like newspaper or notebook pages, and tear it into small pieces. Soak the pieces in a bowl of warm water for a few minutes, then blend them with more water to create a thick gray pulp. This is your version of the mulberry bark and rag slurry. Next, you will need a mold. Stretch a piece of window screen or even an old pair of tights over a small wooden frame or an embroidery hoop. Pour your pulp into a shallow baking dish filled with a few inches of water. Then slide your screen underneath the floating fibers and lift it up, letting the water drain away. What remains is a fragile, wet sheet of interlocked fibers. Press a cloth or towel on top to soak up extra water, then carefully flip it onto a flat surface to dry. In a day or two, you will have your own piece of handmade paper, rough around the edges and full of character. When you write on it, think of Cai Lun in his workshop or the craftsman in Fabriano. You have just completed the same essential process, transforming discarded scraps into a brand new surface for ideas. These simple acts bridge an unimaginable gap. When you press a wedge into clay, you are not just making a mark, you are feeling the birth of a record. When you lift that screen and see a sheet of paper form, you are witnessing the moment a thought gains a physical body. History is not just something you read about, it is something you can do, a conversation across time that starts with your own two hands. That simple act of pressing clay or lifting a screen connects you to a chain of innovation 10,000 years long. It began with a farmer's need to count sheep in the mud of Mesopotamia, and it led to the illuminated manuscript, the printed book, and the very page you might be sketching on right now. This entire journey, from those first clay tokens to the paper in our notebooks, was not merely about creating tools, it was about building the foundation for history itself. Before writing, our past was a story told by the victors, shifting with each generation's memory. After writing, events could be fixed, laws could be recorded and debated, not just whispered and distorted. A king's decree in Babylon could be read in another city, unchanged. A poet's verse in Rome could be copied and cherished in a distant province centuries later. Writing and paper created a shared, external memory for our species, a way to freeze a moment of thought and send it sailing into the future. They allowed stories, laws, and scientific discoveries to travel across space and time, piling up, generation upon generation, into the vast library of human knowledge we inherit today. Every book you have ever loved, every constitution that protects a nation, every scientific formula that explains the stars, exists because someone, long ago, solved the puzzle of how to make memory visible. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, think about the quiet power you hold. You are part of this unbroken story. What historical mystery, from the Indus Valley script to a forgotten library, captures your imagination the most? And if you could invent a new script of your own, what is the one message, the one idea, you would most want to etch into permanence to send forward on its own journey through time? Share your thoughts below and let us keep this ancient, wonderful conversation going.